The fire in the great hearth of the Broken Antler Tavern had been dying since the second hour past midnight, and no one had asked me to tend it yet. That was the kind of invisible I had become. I moved between the long oak tables with a clay pitcher in each hand, refilling tankards without being thanked, collecting empty bowls without being acknowledged, stepping aside when warriors twice my size lurched toward the door without so much as glancing at me. My name in this place was Girl, or You There, or nothing at all. I had stopped flinching at that a long time ago. The Broken Antler sat near the outer wall of Caldenmore, the largest settlement within 3 days' ride of the royal seat of Veldrath. It was the kind of tavern that smelled permanently of wet wool, tallow candles, and something else beneath both, something older and sharper that I had never quite been able to name. The beams were black with years of smoke. The rushes on the floor were never fresh enough, and the men who filled those benches every night were not the kind who left generous payment behind when they stumbled out at dawn. I was 23 years old, and I had worked the floor of this tavern since I was old enough to carry a full pitcher without spilling. Before that, I had swept the yard. Before that, I had peeled roots in the kitchen beside old Marin, who was the closest thing to family I had kept since my mother's passing. Marin was still in that kitchen tonight, her knuckles red from the cold that crept through the stones, muttering prayers to the old gods between stirs of the pot. She was the only one here who knew my full name. "Kate," she would say, with that low, careful voice. "Keep your head down and your feet moving. That is how a woman like you survives a place like this." I had listened. I always listened. Which was why, when the outer door opened at the 3rd hour and every single wolf in that room went still, I noticed before anyone spoke a word. It was not the cold that came in with them. It was the pressure, the kind that lives in the air just before lightning strikes, when the hairs along your arms rise without reason, and your body understands something your mind has not caught up to yet. My steps slowed. The pitcher in my right hand felt heavier. 4 of them came through the door first. Tall men in dark traveling cloaks, their boots mud-caked from the road, their hands resting near the hilts of their swords, with the practiced ease of those who had drawn steel many times and never hesitated. Their eyes swept the room in a single clean arc, not curious, not searching. Assessing, the way wolves look at an open field before they cross it. Wolves. Yes, that was what they were. I had grown up knowing the difference between an alpha and a common man, between the kind of power that is trained and the kind that is born. These men were not guards or mercenaries. They were pack soldiers. And the deference in the way even the drunkest brawlers at the corner table straightened their spines told me that every other wolf in the Broken Antler had recognized exactly what walked among them. And then he came through the door. I do not know how to explain what happened in my chest when I first saw him. It was not admiration, exactly. It was closer to the sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff you did not know was there. That sudden, lurching awareness of scale, of how very small you are against something vast. He was taller than the soldiers who flanked him. His hair was black, worn in long, heavy braids that fell past his shoulders and caught the firelight in strange ways, like dark water moving. His eyes, even across the length of that smoky, crowded room, were the color of a winter sky just before the last light leaves it. A pale, piercing blue that did not blink when it landed on something. A faint scar traced the edge of his jaw, old and silver pale, the kind that had been earned rather than given. He wore a tunic and vest of dark leather, strapped across the chest with belts that crossed in an X, bracers at his wrists, a fur mantle at his shoulders so black it seemed to swallow the edges of the candlelight. No crown, but there was no need for one. Every line of him announced what he was. Orion, King of Veldrath, Alpha above all alphas in the Northern Realm. I had heard his name spoken in this tavern the way people speak of storms and old wars, with a mixture of fear and inevitability. He had ended the border skirmishes without negotiation. He had stripped 3 noble houses of their rank in a single council session. He had not taken a queen in 10 years of rule, and the rumors about why ranged from brutality to grief to something colder and stranger that no one dared say clearly. He was here, in the Broken Antler, and I was standing 3 feet from the table they were moving toward, with a half-empty pitcher of watered ale in my hand. Wearing a dress that had been mended at the hem so many times the thread was more patched than cloth. I made the obvious choice. I turned, intending to disappear into the kitchen. You. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the way thunder carries, not by volume but by the way it changes everything in the air around it. I stopped. Every other person in that tavern stopped with me, though they were more careful about not showing it. Heads bent, eyes dropped. Conversations did not so much end as dissolve. I turned back slowly. He was looking at me. Not through me, not past me, not in that way that men in taverns looked at serving girls, as backdrop, as convenience, as furniture that moved. He was looking at me with those winter sky eyes, and there was something in the look that I could not interpret, something sharp and almost puzzled, as if I had done something unexpected, and he was still deciding what it meant. I held the pitcher in both hands and waited. One of his soldiers leaned close to him and murmured something. Orion did not acknowledge it. He did not look away from me. "Bring wine," he said. "The table by the south wall." That was all. He walked to the table. His men followed. The room breathed again, carefully, like a man checking to see whether a wound is serious. I went to the kitchen. Myron looked up from the fire the moment I pushed through the door, and whatever she saw on my face made her set down the ladle. "What happened?" "The Alpha King is here," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. "He wants wine. South wall table." Myron was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was long for her. Then she moved to the shelf where the better wine was kept, the dark bottles that the innkeeper only opened for noble guests, and she pressed one into my hands. Her grip tightened around my fingers before she let go. "Head down," she said quietly. "Feet moving." I nodded. I went back through the door, back. What I did not tell Marin, what I barely allowed myself to think clearly even in the privacy of my own mind, was that when Orion's gaze had found me across that room, something inside my chest had done something it had never done before. Not fear, not quite. Something that felt terrifyingly like recognition. I carried the wine to the south wall table. I set it down without spilling. I kept my eyes on the table surface, on the grain of the wood, on the task. And then his second in command, a broad, dark-bearded beta named, I would later learn, Kalin, looked at me with a smile that was not kind and said, loudly enough for the table to hear, "Little Omega, you are braver than I expected, walking up to this table without your hands shaking." It was a test, the kind wolves give to see what flinches. I finally looked up, and I met the Alpha King's eyes directly. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the fire crackle in the hearth across the room. His expression did not change, but something moved behind those pale eyes. Something fast and unreadable and alive. And for one suspended moment, I had the distinct and irrational sense that I had just passed something without knowing what it was. "Leave her," Orion said, still looking at me. Kalin went quiet instantly. I set the cups on the table with steady hands, turned, and walked away. Behind me, I heard nothing. No laughter, no dismissal, only silence, and beneath it, the low, almost imperceptible sound of the Alpha King exhaling, slow and deliberate, like a man recalibrating something he had been certain of only moments before. I did not look back, but I felt it, the weight of that gaze following me across the room, long after I had disappeared into the crowd. I did not sleep that night. When the last candle in the tavern was snuffed and the final patron stumbled out into the cold dark of Caldenmoor streets, I sat on the narrow bench in the kitchen beside the dying embers and tried to make sense of what had settled in my chest, like a stone dropped in still water. The ripples would not stop. Marin had gone to bed an hour before, her prayers finished, her bones tired. The innkeeper, Brocas, a heavy-set man with a permanent squint and ink-stained fingers from tallying his coin, had retreated to his room the moment the king's soldiers had secured the upper floor for their lord's rest. He had not spoken to me directly all evening, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the way he had watched me from the corner of his eye every time I crossed the room toward the south wall table. I noticed things like that. I always had. When you spend years being invisible, you develop a different kind of sight. You stop looking at what people show you and start watching what they try to hide. What Brocas was hiding, I suspected, was nervousness. The Alpha King did not stop at taverns like the Broken Antler without reason. Men like Orion of Veldrath did not move without intention. And the fact that he had not announced himself, had not sent riders ahead to clear the road, or demand prepared quarters at the Lord's Hall in Caldenmoor's upper district, meant that whatever had brought him here, he had not wanted it known in advance. I pulled my knees up to my chest and stared at the embers. Leave her. 2 words. Spoken without heat, without explanation. The kind of command that does not justify itself because it does not need to. And Kalin, who had the shoulders of a war stallion and the kind of confidence that came from years of being the most dangerous thing in any given room, had simply gone quiet. What unsettled me was not the command itself. It was the pause before it. That single, suspended breath in which Orion had looked at me not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as something that required actual attention. No one had looked at me that way in a very long time. I let the thought dissolve before it could become something dangerous, rose from the bench, and went to check that the kitchen door was bolted for the night. Morning came gray and damp, the kind of autumn dawn that smells of wet stone and wood smoke, and the particular cold that seeps through walls no matter how well they are kept. I rose before Marin, built up the kitchen fire, and had the morning broth started before the first guard post outside changed its watch. I had almost convinced myself that the previous night had been ordinary, that I had simply served wine to powerful men and survived it, as I had survived many things, when the door between the kitchen and the main hall opened and Kalin filled the frame. He was even larger in morning light. Dark-bearded, broad through the jaw, with pale green eyes that held a quality I recognized from certain animals, the absolute conviction that they could afford to be patient because the outcome was already decided. He looked at me without the performance of the night before. No baiting smile. Just assessment. "The king wants breakfast," he said, "and he wants you to bring it." Marin, who had appeared silently at the hearth behind me, said nothing, but I felt her stillness the way you feel a held breath. "I will bring it when it is ready," I said. Kalin's eyes narrowed slightly. "He does not generally wait." "Then he will have the rare experience of it this morning," I said, and turned back to the fire. There was a pause long enough that I thought he might argue. Then I heard his footsteps retreat, and the door swung shut. Marin touched my shoulder once, briefly, and returned to her work without a word. But her hand had been shaking. Mine had not. I thought about that while I cut the bread. I brought the tray to the south wall table 20 minutes later. It held dark bread, soft cheese, a bowl of the morning broth, a small portion of salted pork, and a cup of the herbed tisane that Marin brewed for cold mornings, the kind that cleared the head and settled the stomach after a long ride. Orion was alone. In the full light of the morning, without the dramatic entrance of the night before, he was somehow both more and less than I had expected. The fur mantle was gone. He wore the leather vest and the crossed belts, his braids loose and slightly undone at the ends from sleep, and he sat at the table with a rolled parchment spread before him, one hand holding the edge flat, his eyes moving over something written there. He did not look up when I approached. I set the tray down carefully, arranged the cup, straightened the bread. You are not afraid of me." It was not a question. His voice in the morning was lower, rougher at the edges, still that particular quality that made the air feel different, but stripped of the ceremony of the night before. I considered the statement honestly, the way I always considered things before I spoke. "I am somewhat afraid of you," I said, "but I'm more afraid of burning the bread." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth. Barely a movement, hardly worth naming, but it was there. "Sit," he said. "I have work too. Sit." Not louder, just final. I sat across from him. He rolled the parchment closed and set it aside. Then he looked at me with those pale blue eyes in the gray morning light, and whatever had moved through his expression the night before was still there. That quality of a man encountering something he had not prepared a category for. "Last night," he said, "when Kalin spoke to you, your scent did not change." I held his gaze. "My scent. Fear has a scent," he said simply. "So does anger. So does submission. When wolves test omegas in the way Kalin tested you, there is always a shift. Always something that changes in the air." He paused. "Yours did not." I thought about this carefully. "Perhaps I have had a great deal of practice at not shifting," I said. Something moved in those eyes. Not softness, exactly. Something more like a recalculation. "What is your name?" he asked. "Kate." "How long have you served in this place, Kate?" "Long enough to know which tables tip and which ones don't," I said. "And long enough to know that when a king rides into a village tavern without announcement and sits at a back wall table, it is not because he wanted a change of scenery." The almost movement at the corner of his mouth again. "You are observant." "I am invisible," I said, and heard how flat and truthful it came out. Invisible people see everything. He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than the others. Outside, the wind moved against the shuttered windows with a low, mournful sound. Somewhere above us, one of his soldiers crossed the floor, and the boards creaked under the weight of armored steps. "I came to Caldenmore," Orion said finally, "because there are reports of unrest along the northern trade road. Merchants disappearing, convoys delayed without explanation. My council believes it is bandits." His eyes held mine. "I do not believe it is bandits." I did not ask him why he was telling me this. I suspected he was not entirely sure himself. "There is a man," I said slowly, "who comes through Caldenmore every fortnight. He carries a trader's seal, but he never carries goods. He sits at the corner table, far corner near the door, and he meets with different men each time. They do not eat. They do not drink. They speak quietly for perhaps half an hour, exchange something small enough to fit in a closed fist, and they leave separately." Orion had gone very still. "How many times have you seen this?" he asked. 7, I said. "The last was 4 nights ago." He looked at me for a long moment. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the shutters, and the fire in the hearth popped once, sharp as a snapped bone. "And you told no one," he said. "I am a tavern girl," I said quietly. "No one would have listened." The words landed in the room like something heavy and true. He did not contradict them, which told me he understood exactly how the world worked for someone in my position. But he was looking at me now with something that was entirely different from the way anyone had looked at me in the Broken Antler before. Something that was not pity, and was not dismissal, and was not the casual blindness of men who looked through serving girls like glass. He was looking at me as though I were useful. As though I were, in some way he had not anticipated this morning, necessary. "Kalin," he called, without raising his voice. The Beta appeared in the doorway of the hall within seconds. His eyes went immediately to me, seated across from the king, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, quickly controlled. "Bring my map of the northern road," Orion said, "and close the outer door." Kalin disappeared. The outer door of the tavern shut with a solid thud, and in the quiet that followed, with the morning gray at the windows and the fire warm at my back, the Alpha King of Veldrath spread his hands flat on the table and looked across at a tavern girl who had been invisible for years. "Tell me everything you remember," he said. And for the first time in longer than I could clearly recall, someone was waiting, truly waiting, to hear what I had to say. I talked for a long time. Not because I lost control of my words. I had learned early that words, once released, could not be called back. And I was careful with them the way a person is careful with the last of their winter stores. But Orion asked precise questions, and precise questions deserved precise answers. And I found that I had stored more than I realized in the quiet chambers of my observation over the years. The man with the trader's seal was of medium height, broad through the shoulders, with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw. Not a fighting scar, too clean for that, more like the mark left by something deliberate. He wore the colors of no house I recognized. His horse, when I had glimpsed it through the tavern's small side window, was a dark roan with no brand on its flank. The men he met changed each time, but 3 had repeated. One was a tanner from the lower district of Caldenmore, a man named Pedrick who had started coming to the Broken Antler about 8 months ago, and always paid with coin that was slightly too new and slightly too clean for a tanner's earnings. One was a traveler I did not know by name, but whose cloak bore a stitched emblem at the collar, a design I described carefully to Orion, who went very still when I finished. The third was a woman, which was what had made me notice her in the first place. Women did not often conduct quiet business in back corners of taverns at odd hours. She was older, gray at the temples, and she moved with the posture of someone who had once been trained to stand in formal courts. Kalin had spread the map of the northern road across the table by then, and Orion was marking points on it with the blunt end of a stylus while I spoke. He did not interrupt. He did not express doubt. He simply listened and marked and occasionally asked me to repeat a detail with such focused attention that I felt the strange, slightly vertiginous sensation of being taken seriously after years of existing in the margins of other people's conversations. When I finished, Orion sat back and looked at the map for a long moment. Kalin broke the silence first. "She could be wrong," he said. Not unkindly, exactly, but with the practiced caution of a man whose role was to question assumptions before they became decisions. Or she could be constructing a story, an Omega girl with information convenient to the king's purpose, appearing exactly when... "She described the collar emblem," Orion said quietly, cutting across him. Kalin stopped. "The one she described," Orion continued, his eyes still on the map, "is the private seal of House Draven, which has been officially dissolved for 6 years. He paused. "Which means the only people still using it are the ones who believe it will rise again." The silence in the tavern was very different now from the ordinary morning quiet. It had weight to it. Shape. I looked between them carefully. "House Draven," I said slowly. "The house that was stripped of its lands after the Northern Conspiracy." Orion looked at me sharply. "You know your kingdom's history." "Marin taught me to read," I said. "And the innkeeper has a collection of old records and histories in the back room that no one else ever opens. I have had a great deal of time and very little else to do with it." Something crossed Kalin's face then. Not the suspicion from before, but something more complicated. He was reassessing me. I could see it, turning me over in his mind like a puzzle piece he had been holding upside down. Orion rose from the table. He was very tall standing. I had noted it the night before, but in the enclosed space of the morning tavern it registered differently, as a fact about the room rather than just the person. He moved to the window and looked out at the gray Caldenmore morning, his hands clasped behind his back, his braids fallen forward over his shoulders. "How many people in this village know your face?" he asked without turning. I considered. "Most of them. I have served here for years." "And how many of them truly see you when they look?" The question was quiet and strangely careful. I answered it honestly. "Almost none." He turned from the window then, and his pale eyes found mine with the same directness that had stopped me in my tracks the night before. "Then you are more valuable to me here than any soldier I could post." I felt the shape of what he was suggesting before he said it clearly, and a complicated mixture of things moved through me. Something that might have been fear, and something that was unmistakably treacherously close to wanting to say yes. "You want me to watch," I said. "Continue as I am. Report what I see." "The man with the trader's seal will return," Orion said. "You said every fortnight. That means within 10 days. He paused. "I cannot station my soldiers here without alerting whoever is watching this road. But a tavern girl who has always been here, who has always been invisible, is still invisible," I finished. He nodded once, slow and certain. I looked down at my hands on the table. The knuckles were rough from cold water and work, the skin dry at the wrists where my sleeves did not reach. Ordinary hands. A servant's hands. "And if the people I am watching realize I am watching them?" I asked. "Then you send word to the garrison at the East Road, and you do not wait to see what happens next," Kalin said, his voice different now, stripped of its earlier edge, something closer to direct concern. "There will be a soldier stationed at the garrison who will know your face." "Dressed as what?" I asked. "A blacksmith's apprentice," Kalin said. "His name is Aldrich, young, red-haired, easily found." I looked at Orion. "And you? Where will you be?" "Veldrath," he said, visibly, so that no one along this road suspects their plans have been noticed. Something moved briefly through his expression. "I do not enjoy leaving a problem unattended." "Then why do it?" It was a bolder question than I intended. I felt Kalin's attention sharpen. But Orion did not look away, and he did not look offended. He looked, if anything, as though the question had caught something honest in him that he had not entirely expected. "Because the alternative," he said slowly, "is to move openly and watch everyone I need to find disappear into the forest roads before I can learn where they lead." A pause. "Sometimes the most powerful thing a king can do is appear to do nothing." I thought about that for a moment. "That must be very difficult for you," I said. Kalin made a sound that might, in a different man, have been a suppressed laugh. Orion looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, but there was no anger in it. There was something almost like relief, as if he was not accustomed to being spoken to plainly, and had not realized until now how much he had been missing it. "It is," he said simply. He left an hour later. His soldiers assembled and cloaked for the road, their horses steady in the muddy yard behind the tavern. Marin watched from the kitchen door with her arms folded and her mouth pressed into the thin line she wore when she was frightened, but had decided not to say so. Before Orion mounted, he paused in the yard and looked back at the tavern door where I stood with my apron still tied at my waist and my braid coming loose from the morning's work. He did not say anything sentimental. He was not, I was already beginning to understand, a man who used words as decoration. What he said was, 10 days, Kate, pay attention. And then he was on his horse, and then he was at the gate, and then the sound of hooves on the Caldenmore road faded into the gray morning and was gone. Marin appeared at my shoulder. "Well," she said softly. "Well," I agreed. "You are going to do it." It was not a question. I watched the empty road where the dust from their horses was already settling. "Someone has to," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is not why." I did not answer her, but I did not deny it either, which was its own kind of answer, and Maren had known me too long to miss it. I went back inside and began to clear the breakfast table. The rolled parchment that Orion had been studying when I arrived was gone. But beneath where it had lain, pressed flat by its weight, was a single coin. Not a common copper, but a silver piece stamped with the sigil of Veldrath's royal house. Not payment. The morning meal had not cost that much. Something else then. Something I held in my palm for a long moment before closing my fingers around it. Outside, the wind shifted, and for the first time that season, I smelled the first cold edge of the coming winter on the air. 10 days. I tucked the coin into the pocket sewn inside my apron and went to work. The trader came back on the 9th day. I had almost begun to doubt myself, had spent 8 days moving through the ordinary rhythms of the broken antler with the particular kind of heightened attention that slowly exhausts a person from the inside. Every unfamiliar face at the door made my pulse adjust. Every quiet conversation in a corner pulled my ears toward it without my permission. Maren watched me with careful eyes and said nothing, which was how she showed worry. On the morning of the 9th day, I woke before the birds and lay in the narrow dark of the room I shared with the kitchen stores, staring at the ceiling beams, and thought about Orion. I had been doing that more than was wise, thinking about the way he had looked at the map with that focused, unsparing attention. Thinking about the most powerful thing a king can do is appear to do nothing. A sentence that had stayed with me because it described, with precise accuracy, the survival strategy I had been practicing my entire life without ever naming it. Thinking about the almost movement at the corner of his mouth when I had said I was more afraid of burning the bread. I pressed the heel of my hand against my sternum and told myself firmly to focus. That evening, as the torches along the tavern walls were being lit against the early autumn dark, the door opened, and the man with the trader's seal walked in. He looked exactly as I had described him. Medium height, broad-shouldered, scar from ear to jaw. He wore a traveling cloak of undyed wool, and his eyes moved over the room with the practiced casualness of someone who had learned to look without appearing to look. I recognized the technique because I used it myself. He sat at the far corner table, the door table. I picked up a pitcher and crossed the room. "Wine or ale?" I asked, not looking at him directly, keeping my voice in the flat register of a woman who has asked the same question 10,000 times and expects nothing interesting from the answer. "Allah," he said. I poured and left. For the next 2 hours I worked the room, and I watched without watching, and I catalogued everything. The tanner, Pedrick, arrived 30 minutes after the trader, sat 3 tables away, and appeared to be drinking with friends. But twice his eyes moved to the corner, and twice the trader's hand moved to the surface of the table in a gesture too small and too deliberate to be unconscious. A signal. A confirmation. The woman came last. The gray-templed woman with the court posture. She did not sit with the trader. She sat at the table adjacent to mine, near the hearth, and ordered hot wine, and appeared to be a weary traveler warming herself after a long road. But her chair was angled in a way that gave her a clear sightline to the corner table, and when the trader rose to use the yard, she rose 2 minutes later and was back before him. They had been here before. They had done this before. The choreography was too clean. When the trader finally left, alone, through the main door, with the unhurried step of a man with nowhere urgent to be, I untied my apron with steady hands and told Brocus I needed air. He barely looked up from his coin tallying. "Don't be long." I went out through the kitchen yard, around the side of the building, and walked to the east road. Aldrich was exactly where Kalin had said he would be, visible near the garrison's outer post, red-haired and young, doing a convincing impression of someone sharpening a tool with nothing on his mind. When I passed close enough, I said quietly, without slowing. Tonight. All three. Corner table. The woman with gray at her temples. He didn't respond visibly, but his hand stilled on the tool for just a moment. I went back to the tavern and finished my shift. I did not know what I expected to happen next. In the stories that traveling bards told in taverns like this one, stories of spies and conspiracies and royal interventions, things moved quickly after the crucial information was passed. Soldiers appeared. Arrests were made. The danger collapsed neatly into resolution. What actually happened was 3 more days of silence. 3 more days of carrying pitchers and clearing bowls and watching the door and sleeping badly and pressing my hand against my chest in the dark to remind myself that the strange, suspended feeling living there was not illness. It was something else. Something I did not have a safe name for yet. On the 4th morning after I had spoken to Aldrich, Kalin walked into the Broken Antler at breakfast and sat down at the south wall table. He was not in traveling clothes this time. He wore the colors of Veldrath's garrison, dark blue and iron gray, and he sat with the posture of a man who had not come to be subtle about it. Several of the morning's early patrons found reasons to finish their bread quickly and leave. I brought him ale without being asked. He looked up at me, and this time there was no performance in his face. The baiting quality was entirely gone, replaced by something more direct. "The traitor has been taken," he said quietly. "On the North Road, 2 nights ago. Pedrick the tanner as well. The woman," a slight pause, "was faster. She is not yet found." I absorbed this. "And the information I gave? Was it useful?" "More than useful," he said. "The collar emblem you described led us to a safe house outside Caldenmoor's west wall that we would not have found otherwise. Inside it we found correspondence." He paused. "Enough to name every member of the network operating on this road." I looked at the table surface, the grain of the wood, familiar as a map by now. "Good," I said quietly. "The king requests your presence at Veldrath," Kalin said. My eyes came up immediately. "Not as a prisoner," he added, with a dry inflection that on another day I might have found almost amusing. "As a witness." And something shifted in his expression, something that cost him slightly more to say. "Because he asked for you specifically." Those were his words. "Bring Kate. Nothing else." The kitchen door was open behind me, and I could hear Marin moving in there, the familiar sounds of her morning work, the sounds of the only life I had known for as long as I could remember. "He said nothing else?" I asked. "Nothing else," Kalin confirmed. Then, quieter. "I have ridden with Orion for 11 years. In that time I have seen him request the presence of 3 people after an operation. 2 were soldiers who had distinguished themselves in the field." A pause. "You are the 3rd. I was quiet for a moment. "I need to speak with Marin," I said. "Of course." I went to the kitchen. Marin was standing at the fire, and when I came through the door, she turned and looked at me with the expression of a woman who has already guessed what is coming and has been bracing for it. "He wants me to come to Veldrath," I said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she crossed to me and took my face in both her rough, warm hands, the gesture she had used since I was small, when the world had been too much and words were not enough. "You have been waiting for something to call you somewhere else," she said softly, "for as long as I have known you." "I did not know I was waiting," I said. "I know," she said. "That is how waiting like that works." Her thumbs moved briefly over my cheekbones. Then she let go and stepped back and straightened her apron with the business-like decisiveness of a woman closing one chapter and refusing to dramatize it. "Go pack your things," she said. "You do not have many. It will not take long." "Marin." "I will be fine," she said firmly, and turned back to the fire. "I was fine before you were tall enough to carry a pitcher, and I will be fine after. Go." I packed what I had: a spare dress, a winter cloak heavier than the gray one I wore daily, a small knife for the road, a comb of carved bone, and the silver coin from beneath the parchment, which I tucked into the hidden pocket, and which I had not spent and did not intend to. When I came back through the kitchen, Maren was still at the fire. She did not turn around. But as I passed, her hand reached out and caught mine briefly. Just for a second. Just a grip and a release. And in that grip was everything she had no words for, and I held it in my chest all the way through the door and out into the pale morning where Kalin was waiting with 2 horses and a long road north. I did not look back at the broken antler, but I thought of Maren's hand on mine, and I thought of a silver coin, and I thought of pale blue eyes in a gray morning light, and I rode toward Veldrath with my braid tight and my spine straight and the strange, terrifying feeling in my chest that had finally found a name. Hope. Veldrath was nothing like I had imagined it. I had constructed it in my mind over years of overheard conversations and old records from the innkeeper's back room. A fortress, cold and absolute, all dark stone and iron gates, and the particular silence of a place where power does not need to announce itself. And the stone was there, yes, and the iron, and the silence in certain corridors that made my footsteps feel presumptuous. But there was also firelight in every hallway, and the smell of pine resin from the torches, and the sound of the castle's internal life moving through the walls like a pulse. Servants calling to one another across courtyards, the clang of the training yard where soldiers worked through the gray morning hours, the deep resonant bell from the tower that marked each division of the day. It was alive. I had not expected it to feel alive. Kalin brought me through the eastern gate at midday, 2 days after leaving Caldenmore. We had stopped one night at a roadside inn. He had taken a room. I had taken a separate one without discussion. And in the morning we had ridden in a silence that was not unfriendly, the kind that develops between people who are in the process of revising their first opinions of each other. By the second afternoon, he had told me, unprompted, that he had grown up in a border village not entirely unlike Caldenmore, and that his mother had been a healer who was frequently not paid for her work. He said it plainly, without sentiment, as a fact he had made peace with. I told him that Maren had taught me to read from a book of saints' histories, because it was the only book she owned. He had glanced at me sidelong. "And yet you knew the history of House Draven." "The innkeeper's back room," I said. "I told you." "You taught yourself kingdom history from an innkeeper's discarded records," he said. "I had long winters and an inquiring mind," I said. He had been quiet for a moment. Then, "I misjudged you at the tavern." "Yes," I said simply. "I do that sometimes," he said. "With Omegas, I was taught a framework that did not survive contact with evidence." A pause. "I am attempting to revise it." It was, I thought, one of the more honest things anyone had said to me in recent memory. "That is more than most people manage," I told him. He nodded once, and we rode on. And by the time Veldrath's towers appeared against the pale sky, I had decided that Kalin, whatever he had been at the start, was someone I could trust. Orion received me in the great hall, rather than the throne room, which Kalin told me quietly was significant. The throne room was for declarations and judgments, and the formal machinery of kingship. The great hall was where Orion worked, where the maps were spread and the councils were held and the real decisions were made. He was standing at the long central table when I walked in, and he looked up immediately, and the quality of his attention was exactly as I remembered it, complete and undecorated, with none of the social performance that powerful men usually wore as a kind of armor. He looked at me for a moment. Then, "You are not hurt." "No," I said. "Good." He said it quietly, and then looked back at the table, and I understood from the set of his shoulders that he had been more concerned about that than he intended to show. There were 3 other people in the hall. A woman of perhaps 40 years, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, introduced to me as Sarah, Orion's chief counsel. A younger man, lean and precise in his movements, named Devon, who handled the kingdom's intelligence, a word he used carefully, meaning the network of observers and informants that kept Veldrath aware of what moved in its borders. And an older warrior, gray-bearded and deliberate, called Brennan, who commanded the northern garrison and who looked at me when I entered with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations in real time. They had already known my name. Orion had told them what I had observed before he had sent Kalin to retrieve me, which meant that the information I had carried for 9 careful days in a tavern in Caldenmore had already moved through this hall and changed things. I could see it in the way Davin looked at me, not with the casual dismissal that my apron and my origins might have earned in other rooms, but with the focused attention of a man who wanted to understand how I had gathered what I had gathered and whether I could do it again. Sarah was more careful. She watched me the way experienced people watch new variables, gathering data before committing to a verdict. Brennan simply nodded when Orion introduced me, which I suspected was as much welcome as he offered anyone. We spent the better part of 2 hours in that hall. I answered Davin's questions about the Draven network with the same precision I had used at the tavern table with Orion, and I watched him take notes on a parchment with a fine quill, and occasionally look up with a question so specific it told me that some of what I had observed had already been confirmed through other means, and he was cross-referencing. Sarah asked 3 questions total, each one more structurally precise than the last, and when I answered the third, she glanced at Orion with an expression I caught at its edge. Brief and communicative, the kind exchanged between people who have worked together long enough to speak in gestures. Orion did not react to it visibly, but his hand, flat on the table, pressed slightly into the wood. When it was finished, when Devon had what he needed, and Brennan had confirmed the garrison's next movements, and Sarah had gathered the parchments into their cases, Orion told them to go. They filed out without ceremony. And then it was only the 2 of us in the great hall, with the fire in the massive hearth throwing long shadows up the stone walls, and the winter light coming pale and clean through the high windows. "The woman," I said, "the one who escaped. Has she been found?" "Yesterday," Orion said, "near the border crossing at Heldmere. She is in custody. She will not carry messages for House Draven again." I nodded slowly. "Then it is finished." "This piece of it," he said. "House Draven has roots. They will try again, differently, somewhere else. But this road is closed, and the names we have now will open others." He paused. "Because of what you gave us." I looked at the fire. "I only told you what I saw. Kate." His voice was very quiet. "You held that information for months, alone, with no way to know if telling someone would bring help or danger down on you. You watched, and you remembered, and when the right moment came, you trusted your own judgment about what mattered." A pause that carried weight. "Do you understand how rare that is?" I did not answer immediately. I was thinking about the years of invisible work, the pitchers and the bowls and the floor rushes and the tallying of things no one else thought worth tallying. I was thinking about how what had felt like smallness might have been, all along, a kind of discipline. "Marin told me to keep my head down and my feet moving," I said finally. "I think I was doing it wrong all this time." "Or," Orion said, "you were doing it right, and the circumstances were wrong." He came around the end of the table. He moved the way he did everything, with a deliberateness that was not slowness, a certainty about where each step was going before it landed. He stopped a few feet from me, and in the firelight, his pale eyes were darker, the shadows of the room softening the winter quality to something that was still intense, but was also, somehow, warmer. "I want you to stay in Veldrath," he said. "Not as a servant, not as an informant, though your mind is one of the sharper ones I have encountered, and I would be a fool to waste it." He held my gaze. "As someone whose counsel I want at this table." My heart was doing something complicated and ungovernable. I kept my voice level with an effort I would not let him see. "You are asking a tavern girl to counsel a king," I said. "I am asking Kate," he said, "who taught herself history from an innkeeper's discarded records, and spent 9 days watching a conspiracy without losing her nerve, to stay." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved over Veldrath's walls with a low, ancient sound. "And if I have conditions?" I asked. Something shifted in his face. That almost movement, that nearly there thing at the corner of his mouth that I had seen twice before and thought about more times than I could count. "Name them," he said. "Marin comes to Veldrath," I said. "She is too old to work a kitchen alone through winter. She needs a position here, with a warm room and honest work, and someone who will look after her when I cannot." "Done," he said immediately. "And I want access to your library," I said. "All of it. Not just what is considered appropriate for my rank." "Done." "And," I said, and this one I held for a moment, because it was the truest and the most exposed of the three, "I want you to speak to me the way you spoke to me in the tavern, without the distance that kings put between themselves and everyone else. I cannot be useful to you if I cannot be honest with you, and I cannot be honest with someone who is performing authority rather than exercising it." The hall was very quiet. Orion looked at me for a long moment, really looked, in that way he had that felt like being seen all the way down, past the apron and the braid and the rough-knuckled hands and everything the world had decided I was before he had walked through the door of the broken antler. "Those," he said quietly, "are the most reasonable conditions anyone has ever presented to me." "Then we have an agreement," I said. He extended his hand across the space between us. Not a king's formal gesture, not the held-out ring to be kissed or the scepter raised. Just a hand, open and direct. I took it. His grip was firm and warm, and it lasted 3 seconds, which was longer than a formal handshake required, and neither of us moved to end it before those 3 seconds were done. Marin arrived at Veldrath 12 days later, brought by a garrison escort that Kalin had organized with a thoroughness that told me he had put more care into the arrangement than strictly necessary. She was given a room near the castle's main hearth, warm, as promised, and a position overseeing the herb stores and the preparation of medicinal tisanes for the castle's healers, which suited her knowledge and her temperament precisely. The first morning she was there, she found me in the corridor outside the great hall with a stack of library scrolls under my arm, and she looked at me for a long moment with her sharp old eyes. "You look different," she said. "I am in the same dress," I said. "That is not what I mean," she said, and moved past me toward the kitchens with the unhurried step of a woman who had decided to approve of something and did not need to make a ceremony of it. The months that followed were not simple. The remnants of House Draven's network required careful dismantling, and Davin drew on my recall and my instinct for pattern repeatedly through that winter and into the early thaw. Sarah, who had initially received me with the polite wariness of someone protecting a system she had spent years building, eventually began leaving me notes in the margin of the council documents. Small, precise observations that were, I came to understand, her version of an extended hand. Brennan taught me to read a military map with the same gruff patience he used for young soldiers who showed promise. He never said I showed promise. He just kept teaching me. Kalin, who had begun the story as the man who tested me with cruelty and ended it as something close to a friend, took to leaving the better cuts of meat at my end of the table during hall dinners, which was, I learned, how he expressed both respect and apology simultaneously. And Orion. Orion spoke to me the way he had promised, directly without performance, with the same focused attention across a council table that he had given me across a tavern table in the early morning hours of a gray Caldenmore day. We disagreed sometimes. I told him when I thought he was wrong, and twice I was wrong myself, and said so without being asked. And both times he noted it with a seriousness that told me my honesty had registered as something important, rather than something to be managed. There was more than that between us, slow-built and undramatic, accumulating in the way of things that are real. In shared silences over maps, in the way his hand would rest briefly on the table near mine when a decision had been hard to reach, in the particular quality of his attention when I spoke in council, and others had already moved on. In the evening hours when the hall had emptied and the fire was low, and we sat on opposite sides of the table, with documents between us and the conversation gradually drifted from the documents into something quieter and more personal that neither of us named for a long time because naming it would have made it fragile. He named it first, in the end. On a spring evening when the windows of the great hall were finally open to warm air for the first time since I had arrived, and the sound of the castle's courtyard drifted up with the smell of green things beginning again. He said, "I did not expect you." And I said, "No one ever expects the person who changes things." And he looked at me across the table with those pale winter eyes that had, over months of firelight and morning light and the cold, clear light of difficult decisions, become the most familiar sight in my world. "Stay," he said. Not the same word as before. Different now. Fuller, quieter, carrying more weight than a request about counsel or position. "Not because I need your mind at this table, though I do." A pause. "Because I need you here." I looked at him for a long moment. The fire, the open windows, the smell of spring. "I am already here," I said. And I was. We were wed before the first summer heat, in a ceremony that the court found startling and that Sarah, who had by then firmly and without announcement become something close to an ally, described in her private correspondence as unconventional but structurally sound, which was the highest praise she gave anything. Maren sat in the front row and did not cry, but her jaw was very tight in the way it got when she was preventing herself from crying, which I had come to understand was exactly the same thing. Kalin stood at Orion's right side, and when the formal words were said and the hall erupted in the noise that such moments require, he caught my eye from across the room and gave a single, small nod, the gesture of a man who had revised a framework and found the revision good. Brennan shook Orion's hand afterward and said, "Sound choice, my king," and then turned to me and said, "Sound choice, my queen," with a solemnity that made it clear he had thought carefully about whether to grant it and had decided that I had earned it. I had not started that year as a queen. I had started it as a girl that no one looked at, carrying pitchers in a smoky tavern and watching things that no one else thought worth watching. I had been invisible, and I had survived by being invisible. And then a king had walked through a door and looked at me as though I were visible and everything had changed. But that was not quite right, I thought, in the quiet of the evening after all the ceremony was finished, and the hall had finally emptied, and Orion and I sat by the fire in the way we had always sat, close, without performance, with the day's noise settling into something still. What had changed was not that someone had finally seen me. What had changed was that I had stopped assuming that being seen required someone else's permission. I had walked up to that south wall table with steady hands. I had spoken plainly to a king. I had held information carefully for 9 days and trusted my own judgment about when to release it. I had named my conditions and held to them. I had been doing it all along. The fire in the great hearth of Veldrath burned low and warm. Outside, the summer night was soft and full of the sounds of a living castle settling into rest. Orion's hand covered mine on the arm of the chair, and his thumb moved once, briefly, across my knuckles, the gesture of a man who was not demonstrative by nature and was learning, slowly and sincerely, to be. "Are you content?" he asked quietly. I looked at the fire, at the high stone walls that had become familiar, at the room that had become, in ways I was still learning to trust, mine. "Yes," I said. and it was the simplest and most complete truth I had ever spoken. The story of the tavern girl from Caldenmore and the Alpha King of Veldrath did not end with a battle or a revelation or a dramatic reversal of fortune. It ended the way real things end, not with a final note that echoes and fades, but with a warmth that settles in and stays, with a hand over another hand, with a fire burning low, with the particular piece of a person who has found the place where her particular kind of courage is not a liability, but the thing that holds everything together. Kate of Veldrath, once invisible, now the woman that the kingdom's hardest decisions pass through on the way to becoming good ones. Now the queen who had walked into the most dangerous room of her life with steady hands and a clear head, and the absolute refusal to be less than what she was. Now, simply, home.